all during the discussions about the Texas trip. Abe said to me repeatedly, "I think it would be better not to go to Texas." On November 19th, as we were going over some last-minute reminders for the trip, I told the president about Abe's fear over his Texas trip. The president didn't seem alarmed. He merely said, as I had heard him say many times before, "If they are going to get me, they will get me even in church." He never had any fear. He had confidence in the American people. Well, hello. Welcome back to my channel. And if you're new, then welcome. I am Jess Cannell, and I would love to earn your subscription today. Well, we've been going through this book, and I think we're going to continue, although we might not read all of it. I think we might touch on Watergate and Vietnam and the ways they are connected to Dallas. We might do Richard Nixon. Let me know if you're interested in that in the comments. And then we're going to do clandestinism by L. Fletcher Prouty. So if you're interested in those things, let me know in the comments. I think that's where we're going next, right after this video. But I saw this book on my shelf and I realized I've had it for quite a while, intending to just do one episode with you guys about it. I do want to say, y'all, I got these new glasses, and while I really like them, and if you don't, please keep it to yourself. I'm trying to just be content. One thing that I don't love is this shadow that's produced right where my eyes are. So there's probably a solution for that, and I will try to play around with that. Maybe I can move a light up or down. I'm not sure. But we're just gonna have to put up with it for this video because I wanna read this book with you. It is an entire book about Evelyn Lincoln's 12 years with John F. Kennedy. So her time as his secretary, I mean, one of the like little colloquialisms that we talk about or that people talk about with Evelyn Lincoln is people say that Abraham Lincoln had a secretary named Kennedy and that President Kennedy had a secretary named Evelyn Lincoln. Well, I actually don't remember if the one about Kennedy is true, if Lincoln had a secretary, maybe one of his cabinet members. I can't remember. It's not as close to this, I think, but it is true that John F. Kennedy's secretary was named Evelyn Lincoln. That is her on the front with John Jr. and the president. And her entire book is lengthy. And so this is a book that if you're interested in the political career of John F. Kennedy, but you wanted to read about it through an intimate portrait, it says, from someone who was with him all along the way, and you really want more of the full picture, not just his political decisions, but actually like the person. I'm told this is an excellent book. I have not read it all, but the section that we are going to read today, we are going to read the final portion, and particularly her observations of the preparation for the trip, anything she knew about while it was going on, and then her final thoughts, as well as one very interesting thing that she did after the assassination that is not in this book. So we're going to look at Evelyn Lincoln's view of the JFK assassination. Let's start reading. We start with something that is political, but you will see interwoven in her political and maybe even global observations are little moments of the president. So let's just kind of settle in for a different kind of reading than the purely assassination ones that we are used to here on this channel. To me, October 7th will always stand out as one of the greatest days in the president's administration. On that day, he signed the documents for ratification of the Nuclear Test Ban Treaty. The signing was at 10 o'clock in the treaty room of the White House, and I asked him if I could be present when he signed it. I walked along behind him when he went over to sign it. When he had finished and began shaking hands with the senators and others present, I slipped out and returned to my office. When he came back to the office, he handed me a pen he had used and said, "Will you put this pen away with the other pens we are keeping?" And, "Oh yes, I brought one for you." I knew he appreciated my wanting to see him sign that treaty, and he wanted to show it by giving me a pen that had made a stroke in history. You may know this, but if you don't, presidents, when they are signing documents, will often sign, like, for example, John with one pen, and then Fitzgerald with another, and then Kennedy with a third, so that 3 gifts can be given of a historical pen that was used to sign an important document. So he apparently gave one to her, which is really extraordinary. One morning he asked me to have someone go downtown and buy some little model airplanes to put in his bedroom so that he could give one to John when he came to visit in the mornings. It doesn't have to be much of an airplane, just a little something, because he enjoys receiving them. I gave the assignment to Muggsy, who came back with some fantastic airplanes. They turned, they tumbled, and some looked almost as if they could take off. The president said they were just fine. But don't you think I should have something to give Caroline when she comes in with John in the mornings? What about little horses? So Muggsy went on another shopping spree. Near the end of October, the president went to Massachusetts to receive an honorary degree from Amherst College and speak at the groundbreaking ceremonies for the Robert Frost Memorial Library. When he returned, he flew directly to Atoka, Virginia, where Mrs. Kennedy and he were going to spend the weekend in their new home. He came back to the office on Monday very anxious over the civil rights legislation. He worked for an hour and a half on it and finally came up with a compromise proposal he thought would pass the House. Then he went into a meeting on the Algerian question that lasted for about half an hour. While he was in that meeting, Caroline and John came outside my door and tapped on the window. When I looked up, I saw 2 masks staring at me. I remembered that it would soon be Halloween, and I opened the door and acted as though I were scared stiff. They whooped and hollered and laughed, thinking they had frightened me. Then they wanted to know where their daddy was. I told them he was in a meeting. "Do you think he will know who we are?" Caroline asked. "He will never recognize you." They jumped around my office, barely able to wait until he came out and saw them. He too acted scared and told them to go away. John pulled off his mask as if to say, "Look who it is." And the president said, "Why, it's Sam." John was so mad he put his mask back on. Then Caroline pulled hers off and he went through the same thing with her. Both of them pounced on him then. They wanted him to roll on the floor with them. He went into his office with both of them behind him. He called for the dogs and was going to feed them some dog candy he had asked me to keep in the office, but the dogs must have been penned up over in the flower room because they were nowhere to be found. As world problems surrounded him, particularly the recent coup in Vietnam, the president seemed to find an antidote for the tension in Caroline's and John's visits. I mean, you'd have to, wouldn't you? If you were bearing the weight of the world on your shoulders, you would have to find, I know presidents get, each party will sometimes criticize the other party's president for what's typically an August vacation, where they maybe golf or they go to Camp David or they go back to a private, vacation spot, or they just get away. And with all the things that presidents juggle and continually have coming, just like him, he's going to a memorial opening, he's receiving an important, honor, he's traveling, he's doing deals across the world. Amidst all of that, he's a father. On Veterans Day, November 11th, so we're getting close, we're 11 days out from the assassination, the president went to Arlington Cemetery to place a wreath on the tomb of the unknowns, and he took John with him. I felt he was going because he thought Abe would appreciate it. I said to him earlier in the year that Abe was discouraged because some staff members said I was always wanting the president to do things for the Veterans Administration. I suppose Abe must be her husband? Surely not. Surely she's not married to Abraham Lincoln. I don't know who Abe is, y'all. You could tell me if you know. Maybe there's some person that they regularly interact with. I mean, at this point in the book, I'm towards the end, so whoever it is must have already been introduced, but I just don't know who she's talking about. Surely her husband is not Abe Lincoln. While the president placed the wreath on the tomb, he left John and Agent Bob Foster in the car and told them he would be right back. Then he decided to go up to the speaker's platform and listen to the ceremony. So he sent word to Foster to bring John down in front of the amphitheater. Have you ever been there to the tomb of the unknown soldier? There is a quite elaborate pacing, marching back and forth that the Marines there do to guard that tomb. And it's solemn and it's beautiful. I think, we hear that like, oh, there's nobody who does pomp and circumstance or pomp and ceremony like the Brits. And I think that's true in its own way, that the royals have their own really, their traditions that are, centuries old. But this is one that is open to the American people, that you can see all the time. And it is very moving. It's keeping in mind the memory that there are many soldiers who cannot be identified based on their remains, and that we honor them for having gone in it all and given their lives. It's a very moving and sobering ceremony to observe. I mean, that's a beautiful place to be, regardless. I also want to point out that here he is, November 11th, and I guess it would be 13 days later that he would be laid to rest in this same place. The next day, the papers were full of pictures of little John and his daddy at Arlington Cemetery. While they were riding back to the White House from the cemetery, the president was in a playful mood, and every once in a while he gave John a little nudge. One time John hit him back. The president said, "I'm going to tell Miss Shaw on you," and playfully hit John again. John replied to his father, "I'm going to tell Mrs. Lincoln on you." This is the final chapter of her book. It's I Remember Him Waving, chapter 36. The presidential election was a year away, but already President Kennedy and various staff members were working on campaign strategy for the coming months. He decided to go on a southern trip this month for a number of reasons. There was increasing restlessness in the South over the civil rights issue, and the president felt the need to visit some of the southern states and meet with the people and find out firsthand how they felt and tell them how he felt. The Republicans had held a meeting in Charleston, South Carolina, and expressed optimism about carrying several southern states in the next election. He wanted to test the accuracy of this. Finally, the cattle growers were angry about the increase of imports, and he wanted to explain that the real problem was due to their overproduction. He scheduled a visit to Florida. He was to visit Tampa and then go on to Miami the night of November 18th. I do want to point out that if you are interested in the assassination, you'll want to know that on this trip and on a trip that was canceled to Chicago the same month, there were assassination plots. The one in Chicago was almost like a template that was very, very similar to what occurred in Dallas, where there was even a Marine who was a patsy in that situation. But there was also plans for Tampa. And so this was that trip. Immediately after the trip to Florida, he scheduled a trip to Texas, where he would speak in Fort Worth, Dallas, Austin, and Houston, and also visit the LBJ Ranch. Mrs. Kennedy was also going on this trip. In visiting Texas, the president hoped to win greater support in this state, in which the Kennedy-Johnson ticket was barely victorious in 1960. Also, he hoped to patch a bitter internal dispute among Texas Democrats who had begun to insult each other. Bitterness developed even over this trip. Some Texas Democrats did not want Senator Ralph Yarborough to sit on the platform with the president, but the president said that the senator had gone down the line with him on legislation, and he had earned the right to be with him. He insisted that the senator ride in the motorcade and be with him on the platform. As plans progressed for the trip, the president carried on his daily work at the White House. My aunt from Nebraska, Mrs. Nettie Carlson, was visiting us, and I arranged for her to attend a performance of the Black Watch, the Royal Highland Regiment, on the South Lawn one afternoon. It was a brisk, cool day, but the invited guests, mostly children, began to arrive at 3:30 p.m. When my aunt arrived, I took her to a seat near the front and then rushed back to the office since I had gone out without a coat. Soon I could hear the music and the president's voice. He and Mrs. Kennedy and Caroline and John had watched it from the balcony. Caroline was seated on the arm of her daddy's chair, and she had her arm around him. I don't think about that there might even be things where the president doesn't attend, but there's something that's happening where That would be just a perk of being the president, that you could just pop into something happening. That afternoon, after everyone had gone from our part of the west wing of the White House, Miss Shaw brought the children over to the office for another romp with the president before they went to bed. He played with them on the floor, and as he was lying there with the two of them pouncing all over him, I said, "What would the people think if they saw the president down on the floor?" I guess I had the old-fashioned notion that presidents were not human beings. He looked at me and said, "After all, Mrs. Lincoln, I am also a father." There's no doubt about that. After they had romped and played a while, the president went back into his office, and Miss Shaw, the children, and I went out on the steps leading to the garden. John was running around chasing Shannon, the Irish dog, and Caroline looked up in the sky and saw a star. "Starlight, star bright," she said. I suddenly felt the president standing beside me. He wasn't saying a thing, just looking up at the sky. "Star bright, star light," Caroline said. "First star I've seen tonight," I prompted, and she repeated it after me. "Up above the world so high," the president said, and she repeated it after him. Finally, he said to Caroline, "Why don't you go over and say that to Mommy?" And then he slowly walked away. I said goodnight to the children and went into my office. I had the strangest feeling. I couldn't explain it. Eerie, like a warning. I shook my head and thought to myself, once you get out in the air and get away from it here, it will go away. But it stayed with me for quite a while. The next afternoon, he went to Elkton, Maryland, to participate in the dedication of a new turnpike in Delaware and Maryland. Before we left, he had a number of conversations with a friend about getting a fur coverlet for Mrs. Kennedy's Christmas present, and arrangements were made for it. I have to say, many of the details here remind me of the things that I've read about Queen Elizabeth, the way the children were kind of brought into her, what she had to go about her business, and yet, especially the older two children, Charles and Anne, that they were just kind of like seen to by other people, but then they would get like their little quick time with Mommy. But then also like the selection of gifts. This reminds me of things that we've read about the Queen in the past. In making his selection of the gift, he had had samples of fur in the office. He had looked at them and decided that none of them would do. He had me call various people to find out what they thought, and as a last resort, he called a friend of theirs, Mrs. John Kelly of New York, and left the whole thing in her hands. It was all arranged and would be delivered in time for Christmas. It was fortunate the president wore a coat when he took off for Elkton, for it was damp and rainy. We used helicopters to get over there, and it was so cold and muddy I stayed right in the chopper and watched the ceremonies from the window. I noticed that one of the placards someone was carrying read, "We are proud of your work in behalf of retarded children." I knew the president would be glad to see that. One of the things that we've talked about on this channel, I did, I think, one episode about Rosemary. I actually have a whole book about Rosemary that maybe we can go through portions of it at some point on the channel. Her story is such a tragic one. It's his sister, who he was a next door neighbor to her in the family lineup. I believe she was third. So it was his brother who passed away during World War II in a pilot in an airplane accident, then him, and then Rosemary. And she was somewhat slow. It seems like by the time she was 19 or 20, that she had about the mental capacity of a 10 to 12-year-old girl. She wrote letters with good punctuation, paragraphs, thoughtful things to her father. She went to a Montessori school in Britain, and she ended up becoming something like a big sister to the students there at the school. She would help the nuns, and she found a lot of peace and tranquility in her work, while her father, Joseph P. Kennedy, was the ambassador to England. All the other children had been shipped home because of the war, but she stayed on there. And at some point thereafter, I believe when she was 22 or 23, her father saw to it that she got a lobotomy. and she was reduced to the mental capacity of something like an 18-month-old. She was never able to speak again. She was incontinent and had bathroom issues. She had to be cared for like an elderly person without any mental capacity, without any bodily control, and it was really tragic. And she was hidden away from the family, which compounded the tragedy. So they were not allowed to speak about it. They talked about it as if, oh yeah, she's helping out with a school out west, but what had really happened was they had deposited her in a facility, and all the children were forbidden from talking about it. And it wasn't until Joseph Kennedy passed away that the family essentially pulled her back, which was after President Kennedy's presidency. So later on, I want to say in the late 60s at some point, once, actually it would have been after Chappaquiddick that his father passed away. So perhaps the early 70s, the family finally retrieved her and would bring her around for holidays and spend time with Rosemary. But there was a good like 20 plus year period of time where the children just were supposed to pretend she didn't exist. And so, but he did quietly begin to talk about it and work for people with developmental difficulties. And so that's what she's talking about when she says, we are proud of your work in behalf of retarded children. I know we don't say that anymore, but in this sense, retarded just means a slowed child or a developmentally disabled child. And so she said, I knew the president would be glad to see that. From Elkton, we went on to New York, where the president addressed the 5th Constitutional Convention of the AFL-CIO at the Americana Hotel. He also spoke at the National Convention of the Catholic Youth Organization, and then we left for Palm Beach. Abe had gone down ahead of me and was already in our suite at the Palm Beach Towers when we arrived. I mean, that must have been her husband. Abe Lincoln, really? Did he have a different last name? Y'all tell me in the comments. If it's really Abe Lincoln, that is... Unless he's like the 10th grandson or something of Abe Lincoln. It wouldn't even be that long. It would have been like the great-grandson, but he's not. Maybe he was named in memory of Abraham Lincoln. I don't know. Y'all let me know in the comments. That was a beautiful weekend, and we enjoyed every minute of it. The president called me many times during the weekend, and every time he sounded as though he were really enjoying the sunshine. He had brought his old friend and roommate, Congressman Torby McDonald, with him. Monday morning, Abe and I went back to Washington. I went with the president to Tampa, where he was to make 3 speeches before going to Miami to speak at an Inter-American Press Association dinner. It was another gorgeous day, and the president had never looked better. He had a suntan and seemed to be glowing with good health and confidence. As he stood in the stadium in Tampa, his clear voice coming out over the loudspeakers, I couldn't help but think, never has he been in such good health. And now he has a complete grasp of the presidency. The dinner in Miami was a huge affair. The ballroom was beautifully decorated with all sorts of fruit and exotic flowers, and red and gold banners floated in the air above the speaker's table. We had arranged with the Secret Service that we would step out the side door and get into the motorcade cars when the dinner was just about over. It was fortunate for us that we made the arrangements. The president was in such a hurry to leave that Congressman McDonald never made it to the motorcade and had to get a later plane to Washington. I was at my desk the next morning, and as usual, the president called over and wanted to know when and with whom he had his first appointment. When he came to the office, he came out to my desk, went through the mail, read some of the papers, and then turned and went into his office. He rang the buzzer on the other side, and his first visitor was ushered in. After his visitor left, he came out into my office again and wanted to know where the staff members were who went with him on the trip. They are not coming in today, I said. They are tired. Why couldn't they make it? We're here. That's true. You know, there are certain presidents who are high energy. The one we have in office right now is one of those. And there are certain presidents who need time to recover, and even certain politicians. I know that when I travel, it depends on if there's a time difference or not. Sometimes I do great the next day, but especially if there's a time difference, I can be really down for the count. But nevertheless, JFK is like, we're here. Why couldn't they be here? Senator Everett Dirksen came that morning with a group to present a Thanksgiving turkey to the president. The presentation was to be made in the garden, and the poor bedraggled turkey was on the table when the president walked out. He felt so sorry for the turkey. He said he didn't want to kill it for his Thanksgiving, and he gave it away. But before they took it away, he called the nursery school class down under the trees playing to come and take a look at the gobbler. You might remember that Jackie had arranged for a group of children to be brought to the White House, but to have a normal school experience, they set up one of the White House rooms as a classroom. And so she was able to have sort of a normal school experience, but in the protective place of the White House. And so there were a group of children. I think it'd be really interesting to hear from those children. I don't know if you've heard of interviews with them, just to reflect back on their memories of those times. I think it must have been really a sweet thing, but also probably a tragic thing for them to remember perhaps weekly interactions where they would just see the president of the United States and then for him to be assassinated later. But he called them over to look at the gobbler. The rest of the day was extremely pleasant. He had very few appointments, and the ones he did have, he took in stride. As I look back on this day, I believe that he was as relaxed as I had ever seen him. He seemed to enjoy thoroughly being Mr. President. He didn't leave the office until almost 8 o'clock. I sent some memos on ideas for the campaign and the convention to his bedroom for him to read before going to bed. As I typed up his schedule for the next day, I could see it was going to be a busy one. To top it off, he was having the judicial reception that night. I was going to take my aunt to this reception. I wanted her to attend one White House social function, and I wanted her to meet the president. When she arrived, I put her in the cabinet room until the president came out. I asked him to please wait a minute before going over to the reception because I wanted my aunt to meet him. Fine. When I brought her into my office, he shook hands with her and invited her into his office. How about a picture? He suggested. I had a White House photographer to stay around, and I called him in. The president stood beside my aunt and then asked me to stand with them so all three of us would be in the picture. Then he decided he wanted to make a telephone call, and my aunt went out in the hall to wait. When I got the party on the telephone, the president came out to my desk to take the call. As he looked out into the hall, he saw my aunt and waved at her. You know, those kinds of things would be so meaningful to family members, wouldn't it? And you would take extra joy from the president noticing your family members. That would be a really special moment and a memory for everyone. Finally, he went over to the mansion, and my aunt and I soon followed behind him. We're going to skip past that. All during the discussions about the Texas trip, Abe said to me repeatedly, I think it would be better not to go to Texas. On November 19th, as we were going over some last-minute reminders for the trip, I told the president about Abe's fear over his Texas trip. The president didn't seem alarmed. He merely said, as I had heard him say many times before, if they are going to get me, they will get me even in church. He never had any fear. He had confidence in the American people. The day before takeoff, the president wanted to find out what the temperature would be in Texas. A note came over to me saying it would be cool down there, and I gave this information to the president. The next morning, the president seemed edgy when he came to the office. What is the temperature in Houston? I called the Air Force office, and they told me it was going to be warm. When I told this to the president, he became quite angry. Now, where in the heck did we get the report it was going to be cool? Kenny gave me that information. He was furious. He really raved and ranted. When Kenny said the naval aid's office had given him the information, he picked up the telephone and asked the operator to give him that office. When the man on the other line, who incidentally had just reported for duty in office that day, answered, the president lit into him. This was all very unusual. First, his getting so angry, and second, bawling out this Navy man. The president called Provy and told her about the weather, but it was too late to do much good because all the bags had been packed and were on their way to the airplane. So one of the things that we see, as an outflow of this is that, for example, Mrs. Kennedy is in a wool outfit the day of the assassination. And it turned out to be quite a warm day. And so they're hot as they're sitting there in that motorcade. But I will say, to defend the person who gave that report, I remember growing up here in Dallas, there was one weatherman who was reliable out of the three main channels, and everyone knew to watch him because he always got it right. And he actually retired probably 10 or so years ago, but he was the only one who seemed to be able to read the weather predictions and actually make accurate predictions because, just so we're clear, Dallas is in the middle of a bunch of plains, and so things can blow in and blow away very quickly. We don't have mountains that stop weather. We're not close enough to the coast to get only what's coming. We kind of get the coastal pressure. We get things from each angle. We get things that come down from the north and bring a cold front. So we can have, and in November, you could have icy weather all the way to it being like summer. So it may be that the actual weather report shifted at some point and he just got, an older one, or maybe someone misread it. But it is hard to predict weather in Texas. After a little while, the president calmed down and saw a couple of ambassadors before the helicopters started to come onto the South Lawn to pick us up to go to Andrews Air Force Base. I had all my things packed and ready. A couple of days earlier, the usher's office had asked if they could put in the new rugs and new draperies while we were in Texas. And the president and I were looking forward to coming back to newly decorated offices. Okay, you guys, this is really interesting, actually, because a friend of mine just sent me photos of the previous moments. I actually think the photos that I have, I'll put them up for you guys, of the pre-White House Oval Office with President Kennedy. I want to say that one was red, and that the Lyndon B. Johnson first cabinet members had their first meeting in the Oval Office and showed it being redecorated. And the question that came to me was he really such a psycho that he had it redecorated the very first day he was president? But this answers that question. Isn't that interesting? Literally that person just wrote me in the last few days and asked me that question. But they had arranged for there to be newly decorated offices. Very fascinating. Helicopter number 3 came onto the South Lawn, and the ones who were going on that one went out and boarded. Soon it was flying south. Then the other 2 helicopters came in. That meant it was time for me to get moving. I checked his desk again, checked the safes, and looked around to make sure I had everything. I remembered to take my Polaroid along. I was going on the same helicopter as the president. Miss Shaw and John were already aboard when I got there. John was sitting in the big chair opposite the one usually occupied by the president, and Miss Shaw was sitting on a seat along the side. Little John had on a raincoat and a rain hat and was very proud to be sitting in a big seat. Soon his daddy appeared and took a seat opposite John. Mrs. Kennedy hadn't come down yet. The president kicked John's foot, teasing him. John said, "Don't, Daddy." They sat a little longer. The president kicked his foot again, and again John said in a sterner voice, "Don't, Daddy." In about 10 minutes, Mrs. Kennedy came into onto the helicopter, and soon we were on our way to the airport. Caroline was still in her school and didn't make the trip. John and Miss Shaw said goodbye and returned to the White House. We all entered Air Force One and were soon settled down for the flight to Texas. A number of Texas congressmen were aboard, and every time I went to the cabin with letters for the president, the congressmen were talking politics with him. Mrs. Kennedy was back in her bedroom. Everything seemed the same as in every other city we had ever visited when we arrived in Houston and rode along the motorcade. Everyone appeared happy that the president had come. I had some work to do that evening, and so I didn't go to the Albert Thompson testimonial dinner honoring the veteran congressman from Houston. Mary Gallagher, who had come along to be with Mrs. Kennedy and I, went down to the dining room for dinner. Mary Gallagher was sort of her personal assistant that was in charge of her clothes and helping her be prepared for each of the events that would happen that weekend. We spent the night in Fort Worth, and in the morning, we're going to Dallas, where the president was to speak at the Trade Mart. Before I went to Texas, I wrote my sister-in-law's sister, Mrs. Joe Ingram, who lived in Dallas, and asked her to come over to Fort Worth on the morning of the 22nd to have breakfast with me in the hotel room. She replied that she was bringing her cousin and her cousin's daughter with her. I arranged for the dining room to send up 3 extra breakfasts at a certain time that morning. They arrived, and after we had breakfast, I told them that the president would soon be walking by, that he was just down the hall. If we were out in the hall, he would shake hands with them. I had asked the Secret Service agent to let me know when the president was ready to leave his bedroom, and we rushed out in front of my bedroom to await him. He came down the hall in a dark blue suit, striding along as if he was glad to be alive. When he saw me, he stopped, and I introduced him to the 3 ladies. He said he was delighted to meet them, then turned to me and said, "Are they some more of your relatives?" I laughed and said, "Relatives of relatives." He turned and walked to the elevator that was waiting to take him down. As he turned into the elevator, he waved at us. We rushed to the window. He was going out in front of the hotel to meet a group waiting for him there. They had been standing for 3 hours waiting to see him. It was dark and cloudy and looked as if it were going to rain all day. He looked happy down there in the crowd, and people were pushing around him from all sides. Just then, Mary came into the room and said we should be getting out to the airplane. She wanted to make sure she was aboard before Mrs. Kennedy arrived. We said goodbye to the ladies from Dallas and went down to get into a car with Muggsy, Joe Giordano, and Boots Miller. They had arranged for a police escort because all of the Kennedys' personal luggage was following us. Once again, these responsible men were getting the things to their destination on time. We were settled on the plane when we heard a commotion, and the motorcade with the President and Mrs. Kennedy arrived. People lined up 4 deep around the fence, and they were shaking hands with everybody they could reach. I noticed that Mrs. Kennedy was wearing a lovely pink suit. I got out my camera and went up front to take pictures of them walking along the fence. When they started toward the airplane, I rushed back to my seat. It was raining when we left Fort Worth. The flight to Dallas was only 15 minutes long. It hardly seemed necessary to unfasten our seatbelts after takeoff. But I had some memos I had typed the night before that I wanted the president to sign, and I went back into the cabin to see what the prospects were of getting him to sign them. On the other side of the table from where I was sitting, the girls from the press office were busy getting ready to type the speech the president was going to give in Austin later that afternoon. The plane was full of Texans wandering up and down the aisle discussing various aspects of the trip. When I walked into the cabin, several of them were talking to the president. He was sitting in his usual seat, his right hand gripping the arm of the chair as though it were holding him back, and his left hand was on the desk, his fingers flipping through a writing pad lying there. When I entered, I caught some remarks about how enthusiastic the crowds were. "I didn't think I'd get such a fine reception," he said. When he saw me holding the papers, he reached out to take them without interrupting his conversation, which had now turned to newspaper articles, especially the full-page ad that had appeared in one of the Texas papers that morning. That ad had been filled with hate and venom. As they discussed it, I began to wonder about what Abe had said. Well, I might as well show you guys. Since I have this right here, I'm going to take advantage of it and show you. This is the assassination story. And the full page ad that she's talking about was on page 14 of the Dallas Morning News on the day of Kennedy's arrival. And it said, "Welcome, Mr. Kennedy, to Dallas." But then it went down a list of grievances, and it was paid for by Bernard Weissman. I believe H.L. Hunt had contributed. It was a small group of right-wing people who paid $1,400 to take out this advertisement. And you can read it. There are good pictures of it online, but it was a nasty ad, a full-page ad, and it was the one that Kennedy had referred to and said, "We're heading into nut country now." I got that strange, unexplainable feeling again. I looked at the president. He was slightly nervous, but then he was always that way when he had work to do. I gave him a pen and he started to sign the memos, but I noticed that he did not read them. He was too engrossed in the conversation. I tried to look around to see if I could find the article, but he had finished and had laid down the pen. He motioned for me to pick up the memos. As I did, I said to him, "Thank you, Mr. President." "Fine, Mrs. Lincoln." I left them talking in the cabin and went out to my seat. I put the memos in my briefcase so I would have them when I got back to Washington. Mary Gallagher had been in the bedroom compartment helping Mrs. Kennedy during the flight. Just before we were to land, she came out and sat down beside me. I looked out the window and said, "Look, Mary, the sun is shining, and it looks like it is going to be warm. I don't believe I'll need my coat." It occurred to me that the bubble top on the limousine wouldn't be necessary. I knew the president would love that. He always wanted to get as close to the people as he could. I knew he disliked being cooped up and would much prefer to wave to the crowds in the Dallas streets. It was time for us to get off the plane and get into our car to go in the motorcade. I turned as we walked along and I saw that the president and Mrs. Kennedy were shaking hands with the local officials who had come out to greet them and were slowly moving toward their car. There was a huge crowd at the airport and it took several minutes for the cars to get moving because of the people pressed up against the president's car. Mrs. Kennedy was carrying a bouquet of red roses that had been presented to her when they arrived. As I got into the car, I looked over to the president's car, which had started to move. There was the president, his right hand in the air, waving at the people as he drove by. I can still see that scene. the president waving as he passed that vast and friendly crowd of people. And I'll always remember him that way because that's the way he really was. A handsome, young, energetic president who had grace and intellect. A man who loved every inch of his country, especially its people. For many weeks, my life resembled that of a sunflower in darkness. The source of energy and direction gone, I could only stand aimless and bewildered. Gradually, I began to think of him in the way I believe he would want to be remembered, as someone living in history. She goes on, and I'm not going to read all of her recollections, but I will read the last 2 paragraphs. She says, "Everyone remembers his rocking chair, but I think of his black briefcase, battered and always full of papers. It is the better symbol for him. It suggests the kind of man who found his happiness through, as he once said, quote, full use of your powers along lines of excellence." That's what he did. And doing so, he reminded us that the greatest of the promises of America is that here, all of us should have the right to do the same. I love that aim, and I've heard that quote from him before, that we can find happiness through the full use of your powers along lines of excellence. Whatever capacities, whatever resources, whatever skills and abilities you have, to use those in the pursuit of excellence. The very, very excellent aim. Well, that is her final thoughts about her 12 years with John F. Kennedy. However, I had a viewer, thank you very much to Ronald Putnam, who shared this next little tidbit with me. It is found, oddly enough, in the Gettysburg Museum. So if you go to there's people who will go and take a tour of all the Civil War battlefields, for example. And there is a museum at Gettysburg. And in that museum, I believe because Evelyn Lincoln's hometown was relatively close to there, this ended up there. I'll show it to you. This is my copy, so not a good copy. I have a better photo that I'll put on the side here so that you can see it. But the little placard above it says, this list was made by JFK's secretary, Evelyn Lincoln, en route back to Washington from Dallas, 11/22/63. So she's on that plane with the president in the casket, where the oath of office has just been said. And this is a list of people she thought might be involved with President Kennedy's death. This politically explosive list was made before Lee Harvey Oswald was charged. So she is in the air making this list. And I want you to see who's at the top of it. It actually stands out to me that his name was never in any of the portion that we read. Now, it's possible as she goes through her time, certainly I'm guessing that Lyndon Johnson would be somewhere in her book. I see his name here. But I think it's interesting that nowhere in that final selection did she even mention his name. But you'll see his name is at the top of her list. She says Lyndon, KKK, Dixiecrats, which was Southerners, Hoffa, John Birch Society, Nixon, DM, that's related, I believe, to the DM brothers that had been assassinated, Rightists, CIA in Cuban fiasco, dictators, communists. Notice that communists was at the very bottom of her list. And this is a woman who knew the inner goings on of the man. She was, exposed to all of the things that everybody else was not permitted to know about or see. She was the one calling who he wanted to speak with. She was the one arranging a meeting if it needed to be had. She was the one who could hear through the door and probably heard many more things than she ever would let on in a book like this, because a person like that is entirely hired for their discretion. And so she would have kept those things to herself. But this woman, with that level of access and insight into his work, his day-to-day and year-to-year and issue-to-issue work, this was her list. And I just find it fascinating that Lyndon is at the top of it. I also found it interesting that nowhere during our reading was his name mentioned. So let me know what you thought of that reading. I hope it was insightful for you. I really enjoyed hearing her take on the ways that he navigated personal and professional work, and the way that he even would push back on her like, well, I am a dad. Like, it's not that weird for me to be here playing with my son. Absolutely right. But also the look of him at Arlington Cemetery, that was very meaningful. For me, one of the things that stands out is her list. It makes me take another look at Lyndon, because sometimes I think, well, maybe he knew, but he didn't arrange it. But she thought he was capable of it. Very fascinating. Let me know what stands out to you in the comments. I'll look forward to reading that. I think next time we are going to move forward with one chapter from here. And you guys just let me know as we go through. Are you loving it? Are you not? Just let me know, and we will see you next time. Have a great day.